Hi, I'm Wayne Tuttle, and welcome to Chasing Legends. Welcome back to Chasing Legends. I'm Wayne Tuttle, your host once again. Please hit subscribe, hit the notification bell, go to www.legendofthesuperstitionmountain.com or go to our About section. You'll find all that. Leave a comment if you want. We check all the comments out, answer the ones where they need answers. That makes sense. That being said and done, Jack Sanfelice's new book, Finding El Dorado, out. Check www.jacksanfelice.com. And additionally, the Dutch Hunter Rendezvous will be November 3rd, 4th, and 5th of this year. Everybody's welcome. Just come on out if you want to camp. Saturday night, the 4th, will be when the guest speakers are, and everybody will be around camp. So you can come out for the day and the evening for the 4th, or come out and stay the whole weekend. It's up to you. There's no water, but there are restrooms. There's no electricity. Rules are as how we make them, but generally as a principle, there's no rules. That being said, we'll get into this week's Chasing Legends. This is one that I had something kind of built up. And then I decided, well, I want to look into a few things because, you like a little new information or something kind of to additionally bring to the table. And I went to do that, and then it kind of started to ravel differently. It became more of a puzzle for me. The story we'll begin with here is there were a couple of Mexicans. They're up in the area of Dismal Valley, and an army patrol runs into them. They'd been out prospecting. They had gotten waylaid. They were out of water. They had no shoes. They were barefoot at that point. They had been out in the sun too long. They were hungry. Everything was going wrong for them. So the patrol showed up, gave them some food and water, gave them some limited supplies. But the officer in charge of the patrol said, we have no way to pack you out of here. You don't have shoes. We're just going to have to kind of leave you what we can. I'll give you directions, tell you the shortest route, and you can get to the Rio Salado, the Salt River, from where you're at. And the Mexicans were very, very unhappy. He said, the Apaches will get us. We're not going to make it. And he said, there's nothing really I can do. We have to get back to Fort McDowell, yada, yada, yada. So they left the two guys behind. One of them survived. One Mexican made it out. He made it to Maryville Crossing and finally made it back into town. After that, he didn't trust white people so much. Definitely the army, but in general, white people. However, he befriended a gentleman whose name was William Cage, Bill Cage. He befriended him, and he was a blacksmith, and they talked, and Bill Cage and him had a number of conversations. And before he died, the Mexican told Bill Cage about a place he'd heard of, or they'd found. And this place he called Fool's Canyon, Foolish Canyon, which is another name, could be Tonto Canyon. And he gave him directions. We're not going to go into detail all these direction stuff. So Bill Cage, taking this information, decided to go out and check the area out. He went out, couldn't find anything. It's kind of very descriptive of the canyon. You go down a canyon, and then there's another little side spot that splits into two. You follow one. There's a crack in the rock, and there was good gold. Cage searches for many, many years, can't find anything. But in his journeys out here, out in the Pinto Creek Haunted Canyon area where this is supposed to be, he does find in an area that's known as like Gold Rush Canyon, he finds some good gold, and he starts prospecting there. Now, before all of you jump up and say, where is this place? I couldn't find it on the map, and go on, Gold Rush Canyon is where the copper mining and the pit mines are now. So they basically pit mine. The canyon no longer exists. So wherever it was that Bill Cage had filed his claims and worked at during that time period, it's long, long gone. Now, what was interesting about the story is later Tom Kollenborn said a gentleman whose name was Joe had told him a story. He said, Tom, I've been out in the mountains. I've looked on maps. I can't find this place my grandfather told me about called Tonto Canyon. And Tom was like, I don't know. I never heard of such a place. Tom went there. And then Tom realized the word Tonto in Apache means foolish or crazy or fool. So he kind of like realized this could be the same place that Cage was talking about. And they went out and searched again. He could never figure out if Joe's grandfather was William Cage. And Tom shared that story, kind of like coordinated with it, that the mine's out there. Now, during this time period, not that time period, but Joe, that partner of Tom's, died, I think, in the late 1990s, sometime in there. I had read the story and heard some of the information, talked to Tom about it briefly once, and I went out and made several trips. Trevor was with me a couple times, I think, in trips. We went out towards Haunted Canyon. And I'd wanted to do it with Randy. I think Randy went out once, but I don't think I went with him. And I went a couple other times, and then I went out with Trevor. I think Trevor and Tyler, the kids have been with me on a couple of those trips down in there. And it's really pretty down going through Pinot Creek and then back in towards the Haunted Canyon area. Very pretty country. And I kept my eye out. Now, I was looking for other things, but I kept the description and the different stuff, because I was always kind of trying to figure which canyon could it be, because it was kind of in a general sense consensus. And I'd heard about different mines and different things that people had found in the area. There seemed to be a crack in the ground. Well, in doing this, one of the things I'd want to talk about is William Cage, because he enters into both stories possibly. And Tom had mentioned that William Cage had been born, I believe he said, in Indiana. When his dad met him, he was in his 70s in the 1940s. His dad had met him when he came into Globe or Inspiration or Miami, one of the places where Tom's dad was working, and was looking for work. He was too old for the draft. I believe this was 41. So he's too old for the draft. He's not going to get drafted, but he's looking for work. He was a blacksmith by trade. He had been apprenticed and worked as a blacksmith and as a miner. So they needed a good blacksmith, and he turned out to be an excellent blacksmith. Tom and his dad both said he could outwork anyone half his age, and he was an excellent blacksmith. Cage kind of was into the superstitions, so Tom's dad and him actually found common ground there and started making trips. I believe Tom said they made 4 or 5 trips, and one of the trips Tom made that was very significant to him was he went up with his dad, William Cage, and a man named Monument Smith. Now, Monument Smith, Tom never could figure out who Monument Smith really was. He found several people went by the nickname Monument Smith, so he wasn't sure who that gentleman exactly was, but he was very excited. They went out, started out about 7 o'clock in the morning at the Quarter Circle U. They went up into Peters Mesa, and they camped up there. And Tom said that was a really cool trip to him, being with all these guys and his dad and up on Peters Mesa. He looked forward to it. Up there, Cage told the story of that him and Monument Smith had been up there. And one of the things they'd been looking for was they'd been camped one night, and it was very, very cold, and they found a rock outcropping where they could get the heat to reflect back toward them. It was windy and cold. So they built a big fire. And in that fire, this pack rat had this little den behind it and started coming out with his stuff and his packing and whatever else he had back in there, and was moving it to another location, would come back. And they were watching him make these trips as it was getting too hot in the rocks, and he was moving everything. And at one point, Monument Smith got up and went over and checked, and he found bits and pieces of gold ore. And then there were some pieces of leather. Now, Cage said he thought the pack rat had been up in the rocks somewhere, maybe there or elsewhere, and had found an old poke of a prospector that had some gold and stuff in it. Smith felt it was something more significant, and they went up, made several trips. That trip they never found anything, but Tom always said that was a very interesting story. Now, Cage was interesting, and Tom talked about him quite a bit because he became very close friends with his dad, George. And Monument Smith claimed that he had been, his age, where he'd been born. Tom said possibly Indiana, but he had apprenticed as a blacksmith. And he said he'd actually worked on pack saddles and worked on a shovel for Waltz. He had met Waltz when he was apprenticing as a blacksmith as a very young boy in Phoenix. Later, after there in Phoenix, he moved out to Globe. But he knew who Waltz was and knew some stories about Waltz. What made this very believable to Tom at the time was he talked about Waltz prospecting in Green Valley, California, which they found there's possible evidence of that. And then a number of other attributed stories. One was Waltz and several other individuals and their names in 1864 had been out near the Superstitions. There was an Apaches who had attacked them or drove them back out while they were prospecting, but they had found some gold. Later, a couple gentlemen, brothers Peralta, had been in the same area and the Apaches killed them. And Tom always wondered if those stories, kind of, even though there wasn't a general knowledge, kind of attributed to the massacre stories and all, were embellished and built up. He said it seemed like anything Cage told you, there seemed to be some relevant truth to it, so he always believed William Cage. Well, in doing this story, I thought, that's really cool. And I had a file, William Cage, because I saw it, and then I usually find the death certificate and some information, and then I just file it away. And then if there's a story, like I'm going to do here, or in other purposes, somewhere where someone wants some information, I can go to the file and look for it. I might talk to Tom off and on, but I didn't have anything real in depth. I knew it was a friend of his father's. One other interesting aspect was William Cage was fluent in German, which George Kollenborn also was. And I thought that's a cool tie-in because Herman Petrasch was partners with George Kollenborn as well and spoke obviously fluent German. So I didn't know that the fluency in German between all these gentlemen, which made a lot of sense to me, and as they partnered up. So I was taking all this in effect, so I went and pulled my file. And I'm looking at my file, and I look at, and Tom said Cage had died around 1959. He'd been very ill, and he believed he died in 59. I found William Cage. I had the death certificate and everything. William Omar Cage. Okay, died in 1962. I thought, that's close enough. I mean, it's not. And he lived in Globe, and he died in Globe. Oh, and he was listed as a blacksmith. And I was kind of very cool. And I looked, and I had documents for his marriage and a number of other things. And I was like, okay, his father's name was Alfred. So he is the only William Cage. There was another Willie or Will Cage that I found, but he was black. So I figured that's not the same person. And he wasn't a miner or a blacksmith. And I noticed on a number of their documents, Cage would list himself as a miner or a blacksmith here and there. So it could have been he's working at the mines. So he was listing himself working in the mining company or as a blacksmith, but that seemed general rule. There was only one problem. William Cage was born in 1885 in Hiawatha, Kansas. He didn't come to Arizona till the early 1900s, about 1910. So that kind of left me in a query as, do I have the wrong guy? So I started going back through of anything I could find to find another William Bill Cage associated with that area. And I thought, it is kind of crazy because I have an individual from the Midwest who's younger than what Tom said, but died around the same time. But he also was a blacksmith and worked in the mines and Globe and Inspiration and all. And I thought, I think I have the right guy. And much like Andy Sinbad and a number of people currently, they start embellishing backstories or other information. Now, Andy Sinbad, as far as his own backstory, was kind of pretty clear and upfront about it, even though Andy Sinbad wasn't Andy Sinbad's actual real legal name. But in other cases, people do that, and they will not use their real legal names with people, and they will also kind of change their whole backstory, not having grown up in Phoenix, but now they grew up in Phoenix. And I found this interesting is that this individual had really good information, and one of the things I noticed was Tom always said, we found through Helen Corbin and Bob Corbin and other research all of us did, that Bill Cage knew a lot of information. And we know possibly some of it could have been fanciful, but it seemed to have good information. Why is this? And I can't put a finger on it or pin on it, or I can't do anything yet because it's going to be almost near impossible. When someone just makes some stuff up or doesn't tell you the relevant truth behind something, it kind of leaves it open in an area where it's almost impossible to find out what's real and what's not, because you keep having to doubt one way or the other because there's things that seem relevant and say, well, could I be wrong? But you find out I could be right. Now, in some cases, Social Security numbers, divorce records, marriage records, birth certificates tell you the story of someone, and photographs. But in this case, there's just enough information to say this has got to be the right guy, but it doesn't match the story. So what I came up with, and this could be true, this might not, is that possibly William Cage had come to Globe about 1905 to 1910 when Reinhard Petrasch shows up in Globe. Reinhardt spends the rest of his life in the Globe area. Now, I never heard Tom really speak much of Reinhardt or mention his dad having any type of relationship or association with Reinhardt. His relationship was generally with Herman, which I always found curious because Reinhardt was in Globe. His dad had to have kind of somehow met him or crossed paths. How could that not work? Maybe Reinhardt just didn't want to speak. But I thought William Cage could speak fluent German, was from the Kansas area, that Midwest area where the Petrasches were from. There could have been enough of association that he learned information from Reinhard Petrasch. And Bill Cage could have been one of those guys that just liked to sit and listen to people talk. And if you're one of those people, you will pick up all kinds of nuances and bits and pieces of stuff like Green Valley, California, or this or that most people would ignore from Reinhardt or Herman. You wouldn't really, you were like, okay, but where do you think the mine was? Where were you looking? What did Walt say about the mine? You're not listening to the story outside of that because you're not interested. You're looking for the mine. It could have been, and again, this is the possibility, is that Cage was just a really good listener, built up and understood this backstory. Reinhardt's dead by the early 40s, so basically he could have come into everything and realized, oh, you know what, I've known Reinhardt, and nobody else seems to, I've sat around with him and talked, I know all this information. The one curious thing I found was, though George, Herman, and Bill Cage all speak German, I never seemed to associate in the trips they made Bill Cage and George Kollenborn and Herman Petrasch together at the same time. I wish at this point now, this is one of those moments I would have loved to said, hey, Tom, can you go dig and find it? There's any time those three had interaction together. Because it seems that Bill Cage is always very separate in his relationship than Herman was with George Kollenborn. Now, again, all these people associate the same and it comes through, but we know Bill Cage had information, whether regardless of what source, but then we don't know what's embellished. And it's a really cool story, and I'm sure Bill Cage told some great stories, and I'm sure the ones I spoke of tonight probably substantially are the truth. But did he know Waltz? It almost seems an impossibility because he was still in Kansas during the time before Waltz died. But why would he do this? Maybe it made him feel like he would be more accepted. Being an elderly gentleman and not accepted into the World War II, and he couldn't be drafted, and he needed a job, and he found someone that would hire him, which George Kollenborn did, and accept him and spend time with him. It could have been just simply he felt he needed to nurture that relationship, and it was probably he meant no harm in doing so. It's just he was telling stories someone else had told him, but decided to take those upon himself to further ingratiate him to George Kollenborn. I'm sure they had a great friendship. It sounded like they were best of friends, which is what Tom said. They were best of friends. And Tom had a great deal of respect for him, so maybe it's best that this stuff kind of comes through later. And if you want to do a little digging, it's always interesting to look into this. Is there another William Cage out there who was a blacksmith from the Midwest, who died in the late 50s, early 60s? Does that person exist? Were there two of them at the same time? There's always a possibility. It just seems unlikely. It appears more that Bill Cage assumed something somehow, and information, very correct information, and moved along. So there's your story for today. William Bill Cage, and a little bit of George Kollenborn, Tom Kollenborn, a little bit of Monument Smith, and a few other things wrapped in. Again, maybe you go look for that Lost Tonto Canyon mine. Maybe that's a good one to look for in Haunted Canyon. Tom did print that story, so you can go look for that story, and it'll have the exact directions, which would take a bit of time and a lot more memory than I have to detailed tell that. It has a Picajo and a bunch of other specific things and names. But you can look that up, look for that. You can always get up on Peters Mesa, look for a pack rat area that has a little poke and a little bit of cold ore in it, even though I'm sure those guys the pack rat had a bad ends at that point when they found there was gold back in that hole. But anyways, there you go. There's the story. I hope to see everybody at the rendezvous, if not hear from you by then. Thank you for joining us every Friday in the lives. Sorry for the last few hiccups on the lives. We don't know why, but the microphone has not worked for just the live YouTubes. It's worked in every other situation. So we're going to kind of check it and double check and try to find out what the problem is. So if you see us show up suddenly out of nowhere on the wrong day, doing a live for 3-4 minutes and then we disappear. It's just because we're trying to check to figure out what is the problem. I can't find anything I'm doing wrong. So there's some glitch in the system of what's happening. So we want to get that back on board. But until then, again, check out our website, check everything out, come out to the rendezvous. And for the rest of the week, as we get out of the 110s this week, it seems like we're going to be sailing into the low hundreds and looking for fall. Yes, in Phoenix, Arizona, when it's 102 degrees, that's fall. Wonderful weather. Anyways, until the next time, I hope everybody has a great week, enjoyed the story, and always remember, and you know it, I'm Wayne Tuttle, you're not, and this was Chasing Legends.